Hello everyone and welcome to another video tutorial. So today we're going to be going over the organisation of the brainstem and the cranial nerves. This was a lecture that was first given by Professor Steve Gentleman, and hopefully in this video we'll be able to iron out any concerns that you have. Here is the outline for today's video. So to begin with, we have the definition of brainstem, which is the part of the CNS which lies between the cerebrum and the spinal cord, and it doesn't include the part of the brain which is the cerebellum. And we split it up into three major divisions. We have the medulla, we have the pons, and the midbrain. So if we look here, the parts between the yellow lines, this is all your brainstem, and your brainstem lies between the cerebrum and the spinal cord in the posterior fossa of your skull. So now if we have a look at the posterior view of the brainstem, and we'll have a look at where the cranial nerves come. So just to orientate yourselves, this is the angle that we're going to be looking at. So at the top, you have the pineal gland, and this is at the roof of the midbrain. The pineal gland produces melatonin, which is a substance involved in the modulation of sleep-wake cycles and is released in response to light. However, as we have a thick skull, light can't reach the pineal gland directly, so we train it using vision instead. Below that, we have the superior colliculus, and below that, we have the inferior colliculus. So the superior colliculus is involved in movement of the eyes and neck, and the inferior colliculus is involved in auditory reflexes. Remember that the superior colliculus is involved with the eyes, which are found above the ears, and the superior colliculus is found above the inferior colliculus. Okay, so underneath the four colliculi, we have the fourth cranial nerve, which is the trochlear nerve. The trochlear nerve is involved in movement of the superior oblique muscle. The iBook will have much more extensive detail on the functions of the cranial nerves at the level you need to understand, so please refer to that. With the fourth nerve comes the fourth ventricle, and the pons is the floor of the fourth ventricle, and behind it sits the cerebellum. At the very bottom, you have the dorsal columns, which are found in the medulla, and these are involved in touch and proprioception. So now we're going to have a look at the antero-inferior view of the brainstem, and this is where you're going to find the majority of the cranial nerve nuclei. So the first cranial nerve isn't found in the brainstem. What we do have is the optic chiasm, which is where the optic nerves converge, and 50% of the fibers cross to the contralateral side of the brain. We then have the pituitary stalk and the mammillary bodies. So the mammillary bodies are the lower part of the hypothalamus and is connected by the pituitary stalk. Some places you might hear it be called the infundibulum. And this sits just behind the optic chiasm and is involved in memory and the limbic system. To remember that, mammillary has two M's and two L's, M for memory and L for limbic system. We then have the cerebral peduncles, and these are fiber tracts which have a structural and a functional role. The main motor fibers and the corticospinal tracts coming from the motor cortex come down through this into the spinal cord. Underneath that, you'll see the oculomotor nerve, which controls muscles of the eye. It's also cranial nerve 3, and we've met the trochlear nerve, cranial nerve 4, on the posterior view. So then we have cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve, which has the function of touch and sensation throughout the head and neck. There's also a very small root, if you can see, next to the large one, because the trigeminal also has a motor function to the muscles of mastication in the face. At the pontomedullary junction, we have cranial nerves 6, 7, and 8, which are the abducens, the facial, and the vestibulocochlear nerves. So 6 is the abducens nerve, which controls the lateral rectus muscle. To remember this, we have the little formula LR6SO4. So LR6, lateral rectus, cranial nerve 6, SO4, superior oblique, cranial nerve 4. So number 7 is the facial nerve, which innervates the facial muscles involved in facial expression. So Bell's palsy is when we have dysfunction of the facial nerve and causes a loss of facial muscle tone. Number 8, which is shaped like a spiral, like the cochlea in your ear, is the vestibulocochlear nerve and is involved in balance and hearing. So then we have three different cranial nerves emerging from the lateral medulla. We have cranial nerve 9, which is the glossopharyngeal nerve, and this has sensory and motor innervation to the tongue and pharynx. We have the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve 10. So this has a vague purpose, but we have parasympathetic function from it. And we also have the accessory nerve, which supplies the sternocleidomastoid muscles and the trapezius muscles. We also have the hypoglossal nerve, which innervates the intrinsic muscles of the tongue. So right at the bottom, we have the pyramids and the pyramidal decussation. So corticospinal tracts, which we met earlier, come down from the cortex through the cerebral peduncles and disappear from view behind the pons because of the transverse fibers in front of it. These fibers re-emerge below the pons as pyramids, and 90 to 95% of fibers will cross over at the base of the medulla at the pyramidal decussation, and you can see this on the diagram. We can also divide the cranial nerves into many subtypes, such as general and functional. There's not much to say about the general subtypes, so pause the video here if you're struggling just to go over it. However, to help you with the special functions of the cranial nerves, we have the special somatic afferent, which is involved in vision, hearing, and equilibrium, and we have the special visceral taste. So smell comes from cranial nerve 1, and taste comes from 3 cranial nerves, which all go back to the nucleus solitarius. Nursery rhyme, head, shoulders, knees, and toes, and so for the special visceral efferent, we have muscles involved in chewing, facial expression, swallowing, vocal cords, and turning the head. Okay, so now we're going to quickly go over some embryology. So in the embryonic spinal cord, information enters via the dorsal root and leaves the spinal cord via the ventral root. Note the positions of the GSA, the GVA, GVE, and GSE. In the brainstem, the alar plate divides into two to form a ventricle. Notice that the afferent nuclei, mainly involved in sensory function, are lateral and afferents are medial, mainly involved in motor function. Now we have a look at the arrangement of the nuclei of the cranial nerves. So ideally this diagram would be bilateral, but this is just a simplified version. And make sure you learn the level of the brainstem at which you find all these nuclei. So let's start with the sensory side, which is the part in red. So the first point is the trigeminal, which is all in the GSA. Because it's tri, there are 3 parts to it, and you find them in every level. The second part is for the vestibulocochlear. So as it's afferent to the ear, and your ears are on the outside of your head, you can remember it as being on the outside of the brainstem as well, in the SSA. And if you remember from the earlier diagram, the vestibulocochlear comes from the pontomedullary junction, so the nucleus is going to be in the junction as well, and it crosses over between the pons and the medulla. The third point for the sensory side is for the nucleus solitarius. So this is the lonely solitude nucleus in the center, found in the GSA SVA functional category. So on the motor side of things, we have 6 main points to help you remember where everything is. So the first point is for the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, which is similar to the oculomotor, so therefore it's found at the same level in the midbrain. However, it's in GVE and oculomotor is GFE. To help you remember that, W in Edinger-Westphal is close to V, and oculomotor O is closer to S. The second point is for cranial nerves 4, 5, 6, and 7. So trochlear, which is cranial nerve 4, is found in the midbrain, and 4, 5, 6, and 7, they alternate between GSE and SVE. And you can see cranial nerve 7 in the pons as well. The third point is for the salivatory nucleus. We have 2 of these. So as we spit saliva out, we find it on the outside of the motor brainstem part. So sorry, it will be in GVE. As saliva is found in the mouth, which is on the face, it's therefore under the facial nerve in the pons and the medulla. Now, after the facial nerve, you would think it's cranial nerve 8, which is vestibulocochlear, but as that sensory is found on the other side. Therefore, we skip to the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is cranial nerve 9. However, the origins for this are in the ambiguous, which are found in the medulla. This contains cell bodies of nerves which innervate muscles of the soft palate, pharynx, and larynx, and is strongly associated with speech and swallowing. After that, we have the vagus nerve, and as vagus has been it's found in the GVE, and this is also in the medulla. Cranial nerve 11, which is the accessory nerve, isn't actually found next. It's found in the cervical spinal cord. This is because the muscles it supplies are at the lowest, which are sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius. Cranial nerve 12, which is the hypoglossal nerve, is found in the GSE in the medulla. Finally, to wrap up, we'll just have a look at the internal structure of the brainstem. So the midbrain has a typical Mickey Mouse appearance, and this is something that they can test you on. So make sure you remember how everything is laid out. The brain is characterized by the cerebral aqueduct found in the middle, and you can think of it as Mickey Mouse's nose, and the substantia nigra, which is the dopaminergic neurons. In normal metabolism, they produce neuromelanin, and this is a black pigment and which increases in darkness in age. However, if you have Parkinson's disease, you lose these dopaminergic neurons, so you'll have a paler substantia nigra, and this can be a sign of Parkinson's disease. The cerebral peduncle will vary in appearance, and the inferior colliculus is low down in the midbrain. Here we have the pons, and the pons is characterized by the transverse fibers found at the bottom. So if you see transverse fibers, you know you're looking at the pons. So we also have a region of the fourth ventricle found underneath the cerebellum, and we also have some more peduncles. So the cerebral peduncles hold the cerebrum onto the brainstem, and the cerebellar peduncles, which are found here, hold the cerebellum onto the back of the brainstem. The main peduncle is the main cerebellar peduncle. And here we have the medulla, and the medulla has different forms as you descend through the brainstem, but is characterized by the fourth ventricle and the pyramids and the inferior olivary nucleus, which is involved in fine-tuning motor movements and is connected to the cerebellum. The inferior olivary nucleus is easier to spot if you're trying to decide whether or not you're in the medulla. And finally, we have the lower medulla, and here we look for the crossing over of the fibers at the pyramidal decussation, which we mentioned earlier. We can also see the dorsal columns, which are involved in touch and proprioception. The smaller of the columns is known as the gracile fasciculus, and this has sensory information from the lower limb. So you can remember that as gracile fasciculus sounds a bit like graceful, and ballerinas use their legs, and ballerinas are graceful. More laterally, we have the cuneate fasciculus, and this has sensory information from the upper limb. We can also see the central canal in the middle. And finally, to wrap up, we're going to look at some pathology of the brain. So one condition is the lateral medullary syndrome, and this is when we have thrombosis of the vertebral artery or the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, and this leads to symptoms as listed, which we will go over. So this shaded portion of the medulla is what is supplied by the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Therefore, if we have thrombosis here, we disrupt the vestibular nucleus, and this causes vertigo. We disturb the inferior cerebellar peduncle. This provides information coming up from the spinal cord to the cerebellum and causes ipsilateral cerebellar ataxia, and therefore causes problems with the gait on the same side of the body as lesion. So therefore you'll see a broad-based gait and a slow shuffle. We disrupt the sympathetic tract, which is where the sympathetic fibers pass through, and this causes the Horner's syndrome, which is loss of sympathetic tone to the head and neck, which causes ptosis, which is drooping of the eyelid, and lack of sweating around the eye, which is anhidrosis. We also disrupt the nucleus ambiguus, which causes the hoarseness in the voice as the pharynx and the larynx is affected, and also difficulty swallowing. Finally, we have the spinothalamic tract, which carries spinal nerves and the trigeminal nerve. So if we lose this, we lose pain and sensory information coming from the body contralaterally, and ipsilateral loss of pain and thermal sensation in the face.